The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Mary set out and went as quickly as she could to a town in the hill country of Judah. She went into Zechariah's house and greeted Elizabeth. Now, as soon as Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the child leapt in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. She gave a loud cry and said, "Of all women you are the most blessed, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. Why should I be honored with a visit from the mother of my Lord? For the moment your greeting reached my ears, the child in my womb leapt for joy. Yes, blessed is she who believed that the promise made her by the Lord would be fulfilled." The Gospel of the Lord. If you don't know me by now, simply read, look out. We've heard that song, we know that song, and the first verse of that song says, "Now all the things that we've been through, you should understand me like I understand you." And basically what that's saying is that to really know someone, you have to go through things with that person. You have to have some kind of shared life experience, really to know someone well. It's the difference between knowing someone and knowing about someone. Think of even here in the church today. Look around you. No, seriously, look around you. Look at the people in this church. How many of those people do you know their name? We're supposed to be a family. There should nobody be in this church today who's anonymous. We should know each other by name. But even just looking around, how many people do you know about them? You know maybe their name. You know that they come to church every Sunday. You might even know where they live. But you don't know them. You don't know what makes them tick, what makes them get up in the morning. There is a difference between knowing about someone and knowing someone. Jane Goodall is a zoologist, and she kind of understood that concept that to know someone, you have to get involved in the life. And her study was of chimpanzees. And her contention was that up to her, there were many scientists who studied chimpanzees. And what they would do is take chimpanzees into their labs, and they would run experiments and tests in the lab and in the zoo. They would give puzzles for the chimpanzees to see if they could work them out. They did all sorts of experiments with chimpanzees. And Jane Goodall had an issue with this. She felt that that's not the way to understand how chimpanzees work. Her contention was the scientists would know something about the chimpanzee, but they didn't know the chimpanzees. So Jane Goodall, she spent 60 years of her life living with chimpanzees in their environment. And she watched them every day, she studied them, she saw how they interacted, she saw how they played with one another. She really got up close and personal, so that she really understood what made chimpanzees tick. And by the end of her studies, a lot of the things that the scientists had worked out were found just to be totally untrue, because they were measuring chimpanzees in an environment that chimpanzees shouldn't have been in. Jane Goodall, she understood that she had to be an apprentice of nature in order to understand nature. She wanted to get to know chimpanzees and not get to know about chimpanzees. And why am I telling you this? Well, our relationship with God is very much the same. You know, we can study theology to a doctoral level. We can do lots of studies about God and get to understand who God is, if that's at all possible, which of course it is impossible. But we can do lots of studies about God, about his church, and still not know God or not know his church. The only way that we can really understand and know God is to get up personal and close with him. And the only way that we can understand church is by being church. That's the only way that we'll really understand it. You know, our first reading today is from the book of Micah. And Micah is a prophet, and I think Micah, it's fair to say, has got some anger issues. He's looking at the circumstances of his life and the circumstances of God's people, the people of Israel. And they're under threat from the Assyrians and all sorts of foreigners. And basically what Micah comes to the conclusion is he wants God to smite all these foreigners, to destroy them. That's what he wants. But he reflects a wee bit further and he looks at the people of Israel themselves and he sees that they are unfaithful to God, that they're not being the people that they are called to be. So it's Micah's solution. God, smite these people as well. You know, Micah just wants God to destroy everything. But even in his anger, something moved Micah's heart. And so he foretold, the reading that we hear this morning, that in Bethlehem Ephrathah, there will be raised up a man of justice and peace. Even Micah in his anger could see a time where God would always reach out for his people. That God doesn't want to smite his people. God goes to great effort to search for his people. He longs for them. And that prophecy of Micah sat on a shelf for 700 years until King Herod asked his advisors if these wise magi were right in what they were saying. But before even the magi set out on a journey, there were two women who understood that this prophecy was being fulfilled. Mary and Elizabeth. And we have that beautiful encounter between them today. You know, two women who don't need to learn about God. They don't have to read books about God. They don't have to go to the scribes and the learned people to know about God. They know about God. Their bodies are telling them that God has done something amazing here. You know, an old woman finds herself with child. A young virgin finds herself with child. They know God is at work. And there's no explanation for this. It's out with the norms of nature. Something is going on and they know it. And the first thing that they want to do is to share that. You know, Mary sets out in what would be a dangerous journey to go to her cousin Elizabeth, and the two of them just share the joy of what God has done for them. They are bursting with joy. You know, is your relationship with God one that makes you burst with joy? Do you know God well enough that you are bursting with joy? You know, if God is working in your life, then here's a litmus test to know if it's really God that's working. If you cannot contain yourself, you cannot help but share what's going on, you know this is God's work. If you can keep it to yourself, then it's not God's work. God's work changes our hearts. It makes us want to share. You know, Mary needed to share with Elizabeth. As soon as Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the child in her womb leapt for joy. You know, there is a tremendous joy of the work that's going on here. And that doesn't mean to say that life was going to be rosy. You know, we know from Mary's life that it wasn't a rosy life. She watched her son as a worried mother out preaching, proclaiming the good news, and she saw him getting rejected and ridiculed and mocked, and she worried for him. She stood at the foot of the cross and watched him die. But she was filled with joy, a deep down joy that she needed to share. And the reason that the church proclaims that gospel to us on this fourth Sunday in Advent is it's reminding us why we are here today. We are here today because, like Mary, we know that God is doing marvelous work and that we want to share the joy of knowing that. That's why we are here today. We are here as God's family, bursting with joy. I wonder. You know, that's why we're here. That we're here because we are so joyful that God, we want to share that with Him, but we want to share it with one another. That's what it means to be church. And we can never really know and never really experience that joy and that fulfillment unless we are part of God's church. You know, there's a great lie that's out there just now, and it's the biggest heresy of our time. And the lie is this, that religion is a private affair, that it's between you and God. It's not. Religion has never been a private affair. You know, when God called a people to be holy and to represent them, it wasn't an individual that He called, it was a people, the people of Israel. He called Abraham to start that people. He didn't just call Abraham and say, right, Abraham, you're my representative on earth, you got on with it. He said, no, Abraham, your descendants will be as many as the stars, and those descendants will be my witness. God calls peoples. Yes, He calls us as individuals, but to be part of His people. And He calls us to be His church, to be His representatives here on earth. That's how Christ has chosen to continue His ministry in our time. You know, Christ is present in the world today. He's not present in time and history like Jesus was, but He is present. And the way that Christ has chosen to be present is in His church, in us. That we are called to be that people of joy that go out into the world and be the presence of Christ. To proclaim that good news, to draw people to Christ. Do we do that? And how do we do that? You know, I would bet you any money that every single person here in this church has been in a discussion with someone, a friend, a relative, a family member, perhaps even quite heated discussions about church and about God. You know, and often it's people who are not part of church who have never been part of church, or people in your family who you've brought up as Catholics but no longer practice their faith, but yet they still want to talk to you about it. And really what they're trying to do is kind of justify themselves why they don't go. And so they argue about dogmas, they argue about the history of the church, they argue about the sinfulness of the church. And what you do is you argue back. You defend the cause. And you're trying to convince them that they're wrong and that they need to come back to God and back to the church. Well, let me tell you something. You are wasting your time. Don't do it. Because no one ever becomes a follower of Christ through a good intellectual argument. They become a follower of Christ because they feel loved and cared for. You know, we can take a lesson from the history of the church. The very first century, the early Christians, you know, they were persecuted. They were a small sect to begin with. And these people, they changed an empire. They converted the whole Roman Empire. And how did they do that? Did they stand up in street corners and talk theology? Did they stand up in street corners and talk about the intricacies of the incarnation or the teachings of the church? No. The way they converted the Roman Empire was through their love. That when they were persecuted, they went to their death with courage and not revenge. They didn't fight back. And so they disempowered their persecutors because they made them look as though they were just being cruel because of their love and their non-violence. When plagues hit the Roman Empire and all those in authority and power, they all fled for the countryside. And what did the Christians do? They stayed put. They fed the sick. They built hospitals for the sick. They comforted the dying. That's what they did. They stayed put in the midst of people's need. That's how the early Christians converted the Roman Empire. And that's the only way that we as a church today are going to convert our secular world. Through our love and through our witness, not by our arguments. And the challenge of this fourth Sunday of Advent is for each of us to ask ourselves, am I really living that joy of Christ in my life? Am I really close to him? Do I know him? Or do I know about him? You know, one of the tools that we use in our parishes here in Erskine to help us, or to help people, it's really a doorway into that journey to begin to get to know Christ on a personal level, is Alpha. And our Alpha is about to start early in the new year. But as we approach that, I would ask you to do 3 things. Today, I would ask you to start doing these things. And the first thing that I would ask you to do is to pray for our Alpha course. To pray for those who are delivering it. The leaders, the hosts, the group leaders. Pray for them that they may be guided with wisdom and with love. But more importantly, I would ask you to pray for the guests who'll be drawn to the course. Make that a serious petition in your prayers over the next few weeks. The second thing I would ask you to do is really to ask God to guide you to know who in your life can you invite to the Alpha course. You know, it might be those people that I mentioned earlier who are constantly talking to you about God. Don't argue with them. Say, why don't you come to Alpha? Why don't you come and bring your questions and explore your questions in a safe environment where you will be respected? Let's come and really explore your questions. Let's not just fight with one another over them. So pray, asking God to discern in your life, who are the people that God is asking you to invite to the Alpha course? And the third thing that I would ask you to do is, if you have not yet taken part in Alpha yourself, is just ask God to discern in your heart whether this is something that He wants you to do. You know, you might feel reluctant, you might feel afraid, you might not be sure, but maybe God has a plan for you. And maybe He needs you just to trust Him to take this step. So really pray about that. Is God asking you to begin that journey to really get to know Him, starting with the Alpha course?